Morning, class. Today we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights. I decided I was going to talk, about the Second Amendment, right? And the Second Amendment reads as follows: it is a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Right? And the big debate, really, historically and today, has been between those who want to protect the individual right to bear arms, or those who say, no, that's not what it's about. It's actually about protecting the rights of each state to have its own militia. In a helpful article, Robert Schallhope, written back in 1982, he says, the important thing isn't so much to focus on a 20th century lens, right? It's so easy to view history through the 20th century and current events. He says the important thing is for us to view history through an 18th century lens. And so he does a great job of that in an article. He says that the most eloquent speaker on it was the philosopher James Berg, who wrote in 1774, and I quote, "The very character of people, the cornerstone and strength of Republican society, was related to the individual's ability and desire to arm and defend himself against threats to his person, his property, and his state." John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, writing a little before that in 1755, said the possession of arms is the distinction between a free man and a slave. In other words, if we don't have the right to bear arms, then we are essentially slaves, something Americans can't stand for, right? And the overriding assumption as you read the philosophers and people of the time was that the reason Americans could be trusted as citizens to bear arms was because they were a virtuous and moral society. And did Americans believe in that right? How strongly did they believe in their right to bear arms? Well, Lexington and Concord, right, the battle that kicks off the American Revolution, that was all about making sure that General Gage didn't take their hidden weapons. When Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison were writing the Federalist Papers, in number 29, Hamilton said that circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people, while there is a large body of citizens, little if at all inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it, if it should exist. Writing in the 1820s, Timothy Dwight, discussing this period, he said, "The difficulty here has been to persuade the citizens to keep arms, not to prevent them from being employed for violent purposes," which is how we view, right, bearing arms today, is how do we keep people from using them violently. In that day, they were trying to convince, the Congresses actually had a conversation about maybe requiring the states to pay for everyone to own a musket. Supreme Court cases, right, down through history since then, right, regarding the Second Amendment, all the court cases of the 19th century, that would be United States versus Cruikshank, Presser versus Illinois, and Miller versus Texas, made no distinction between militia and individual citizens' right to bear arms. It wasn't until 1939, right, late in the 20th century, in the United States versus Miller, which then made the decision by the Supreme Court, ruled that the Second Amendment seemed to have more to do with the focus on the militia itself. But since then, right, more recent cases, 2007 and 8, we had Columbia versus Heller and then McDonald versus the City of Chicago, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment applies to individuals and is not to be limited to the states. The Second Amendment could not be restricted, and it was about individual rights. In short conclusion there, right, how can we get more citizens to have guns was the 18th century lens for the Constitution. Modern day arguments, though, let's give the other side a shot. What are some of the arguments against gun control? One of them is, if Americans today are not moral and virtuous, as it was claimed in the 18th century, can we trust them to have weapons and to be armed? Right? Today we've got lots of mass shootings, Columbine, Sandy Hook, just some of the more prominent ones. There's evidence out there that people want some degree of gun control, right? I'm not a huge fan of my neighbors owning bazookas. Training is important, right? That in order, like the amendment itself says, to have a well-regulated militia, we don't just hand out guns like candy, that people should be trained in how to use them. And then there's the contention that the Founding Fathers, when they were writing these documents and wrote the Second Amendment, they didn't have dangerous capabilities of modern weapons in mind, right? They didn't plan on people having weapons that could essentially destroy large populations. I'm not going to draw a strong conclusion, really, on gun control either way. I think that, to be honest, there are good intentions on both sides. To a certain degree, there are people on both sides who want to protect their families, who want to protect the American people. The problem really isn't guns at all. The problem is the people. The problem is sin. Having to register your guns, more registration or less registration, I don't think that's the answer ultimately. Right? The secret for us as Christians is going to be in what our trust is placed in. Are we confident, right, that weapons, that having a gun in our home is what is ultimately going to keep us safe, right? In Psalm 20, verses 7 and 8, it says, "Some trust in chariots, some in horses. We should trust in the name of the Lord our God." Romans 8:31 says, right, that we are already more than conquerors through him that loved us, right? If God is for us, who can be against us? What do we have to be afraid of? So, in conclusion, with or without the ability to own a gun, my confidence and my hope is going to be in the Lord. And I hope your confidence and your hope is in the Lord also. Have a great day. Signing out from here in Dubuque.